Chapter 3. That barmaid was just about the prettiest thing Darryl Champlain had seen, ever. Caramel hair all wavy and wild, eyes as big and blue as a Walt Disney Woodland creature. That was pretty much the complete catalog of his thoughts as he walked out the bat-wing doors into the cooling weather. Since he'd landed here in Big Falls, Oklahoma, the weather had swung between best wear a jacket and cover all exposed skin. There was a nip in the air tonight, and he pulled on his denim jacket as he walked to his truck. His pride and joy. The payments on it were higher than his rent back in Houston had been. Too bad. He loved it. A cherry 1972 Ford, lifted, supercharged, and tuned to perfection. She was fire engine red, and he adored her. He climbed in and sat there a second, the beautiful Sophie still in his mind's eye, hair tumbling over her shoulders. At least it had been when he'd first walked in. Her smile was huge and bright, but never quite reached her eyes, not until someone had texted something that made her holler. That smile had been real, damn near blinded him. She'd arrived a few minutes after he had, coming from somewhere in the back while he sat there talking to the owners, going over the role they wanted him to play. Jason was the kind of man that other men respected, the kind of man they'd follow. He had that way about him. Joey was laid back, didn't seem to take life too seriously. Darryl knew his type. Out for a good time, footloose and fancy-free. Probably hadn't even had his heart broken yet. And then there was Robert. Darryl hadn't figured Rob out just yet. Once Sophie walked in, he'd stopped trying. She crossed the floor to the bar, pulling all those butterscotch and caramel curls into a ponytail on the way, and never looked up. Then she went behind the bar and put on an apron, but not before he'd noticed how perfectly she filled out those jeans of hers. He wondered if she'd be up for a meaningless holiday fling. He started the truck and revved the motor a little, because he liked to hear its whine. He'd added the supercharger himself, and man, did it sing. The interview had been a formality staged for Sophie's benefit. Her cousins had hired him before he'd ever arrived at the Long Branch, but not as the new bouncer. His job was actually to watch over her. Apparently, she had a problem ex, and the McIntyre boys wanted to make sure she was safe. It sure wasn't going to be a chore. He'd liked her on sight, and she gave every sign of liking him, too. People tended to like him easily. Damned if he knew why. He liked them back, most of the time. This time of year, they could be kind of unbearable with their matchmaking and their "we're not gonna let you spend the holidays alone" mentality. Wherever he went, it was always the same, that notion. He liked being alone, did his best writing alone. Okay, he did his best thinking about writing. Truth was, he hadn't written in years now. Not really. He revved the motor a little more. So he was going to work closely with that pretty lady. That would almost make all the jingling bells and Christmassy smells, holly-decked halls and glittering balls worthwhile. Hey, that might have been something there. He took his smartphone from its holster, tapped a button, and sang experimentally. Jingling bells and Christmassy smells don't ease the fires of my lonely hell. Holly-decked halls and glittering balls. He stopped there, made a face. Nope, no glittering balls. And that was about the extent of the writing he'd been doing lately. Then he tapped the app to stop recording, dropped the phone onto the seat, and turned his truck around to head back onto the road and into town. He needed some fresh shaving gear and a hot meal. As he pulled out of the Long Branch's front parking lot, he saw a guy walking, hoodie pulled up over his head, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Something about him made Darryl uneasy. He'd learned over the years never to ignore his feelings. They'd kept him alive in Iraq, barely. Then for 10 years as a cop and a handful more years in the Secret Service before this current hiatus, traveling the country, taking on private work as he went along, trying to find something without even knowing what he was looking for. He trusted his senses. They'd served him well. He slowed the truck, rolled his window down. "Hey there, pal. Need a ride?" He came to an almost stop behind the stranger. The guy just shook his head and kept on walking. Darryl glanced back toward the Long Branch as he pulled onto the road. The guy in the hoodie was heading toward downtown, away from the saloon. Maybe he'd come back a bit early. Maybe he'd just grab what he needed at the local store and head back to the saloon for dinner. They served dinner. He'd eat there. The guy in the hoodie had his nerves buzzing a little, and he was here to watch out for Sophie after all. He drove back toward town, past a whole lot of brush lots and nothing. He rounded a curve and the road became a small-town main street right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Clean, perfect sidewalks ribboned beneath old-fashioned lampposts, each of them decorated with an evergreen wreath. Garland draped from one to the next. Every shop window was decorated, the corners of their glass panes sprayed with fake snow, and their green and white awnings all matched. A big sign hung overhead from one side of the street to the other. It shouted, "Merry Christmas!" And it sounded to Darryl like an order. An hour later, he tucked into his dinner at the bar instead of in the adjoining dining room. This half of the place was deserted, except for her. Sophia. She was tall and elegant for a bartender. Yeah, she wore faded jeans and high-heeled boots, a red and green plaid button-down shirt over a figure-hugging tank top. Hair all bundled up, but he'd seen it down. She was a true beauty. Apple cheeks and great big eyes and lips made for kissing. She seemed at home behind the bar, and yet he didn't think she belonged there. He had to know more about her. The boys had told him precious little. There were several tables full of people in the dining room, but the barroom half of the Long Branch was deserted, except for her. Sophie stood on the other side of the bar and said, "Don't you want to eat your dinner at a table?" "Nope." "Why not?" She was wiping a spotless patch of the gleaming bar. "View's better here." She groaned and made a face. "That was terrible. Seriously, that's the line you're going to try on me? View's better here?" He couldn't have held back the smile if he'd wanted to, so he didn't try. "What's a girl like you doing in a place like this?" he tried, making a question of the question. She shook her head. "Worse yet. How's your steak?" She indicated his plate with her chin. "Freaking mouth-watering." "Yeah, the guys have a great cook. Ned cooked in the Navy. Nothing but the best for the Long Branch." "What made them decide to put a tourist attraction pseudo-saloon in a middle-of-nowhere town like this?" She shrugged. "Not them. Their father, Uncle Bobby Joe. I like to think he triangulated all the ghost towns and other tourist hotspots and put this place dead center. He's a genius at things like that. But the truth of the matter is simpler. He fell in love." She filled a glass of icy sweet tea for him, brought it back, and set it on the bar. "So what's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" she asked. He smiled. "Funny how that line works just fine on me." She shrugged. "You're a guy. Any line will work on you." "So, what's the answer?" He thought about it for a moment. "It's just the latest part of the journey." "To where?" "Don't know exactly. It's starting to look like it'll end up right back where it started, though." She frowned, her brows bending a little. "I have to hear this," she said. "Please elaborate." He looked around the place. Still no one bellying up to the bar, and he'd already seen that she didn't wait tables. There were 3 other girls doing that, maybe still in their teens. She wasn't too busy to talk, and he was enjoying it. "I decided to take a year off and—" Wait. She held up a hand. "A year off what?" He smiled. "Secret Service." She blew air through her teeth like she'd sprung a leak, shaking her head and making her ponytail dance. "Come on, enough with the bar lines." He pulled a wallet from the back of his jeans and flipped it onto the counter. She stared down at his shield, which was the only thing inside. The wallet wasn't a wallet at all, but a holder for the badge. She blinked twice, then looked up at him. "No kidding?" "No kidding. I worked for the governor's office in Texas most recently." "Why'd you leave?" He shrugged. "I don't know. I went to work every day, came back every night. After a while of doing the same thing day in and day out, I just got this feeling there had to be—" She whispered something more at the same time he did. He raised his eyebrows and shot her a look. "You know what I mean, then." "Yeah, I do. This isn't my usual gig either." "No. What is?" She'd been staring off into space a bit, but her eyes snapped back to his then, and she said, We're talking about you. So you decided to take a year off and travel the country, see it all, write some songs. I decided, wait, you're a songwriter? He smiled. Not to speak of, no. Was once. Ancient history now. So anyway, I decided, why'd you quit? Writing songs, I mean. Did you ever record any? Did anyone else? He tipped his head to one side. I thought I already finished the job interview. She smiled. I have an inquisitive mind, or so my mommy used to tell me. It's okay if you don't want to answer. He watched her face. Animated, that's how he would describe it. Her expressions changed with every thought and every emotion. I decided, he said, picking up where she'd interrupted him, twice, not to use any of my own money. It's kind of a challenge to try to work my way from one place to the next, so I'd have to really experience life in new places, doing new things. Wow. She was looking at him as if amazed. I could never do that. No way. I like to plan everything. I have to know where I'm going and when. I even map out my sightseeing days ahead of time when I travel. She smiled, and he liked it. She had a wide, lush mouth with full, soft-looking lips and pretty white teeth. How long have you been at this? She asked. Since last Christmas Eve. And inevitably that sympathetic look he had come to dread came over her pretty face. You left home on Christmas Eve? Yeah, I left home on Christmas Eve. Why does everyone act like my puppy died when I tell them that? It wasn't sad or tragic or heartbreaking. I was bored, and I'd put in my last day and my stuff was all packed. I didn't see why a date on a calendar should make me put off my trip. Sure, I didn't mean... Then she tipped her head to one side and said, Well, yeah, I did actually, but I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. She tried to act as if she understood when he knew she didn't. But then she asked another question, easing them out of the awkward moment with a kind of grace that told him she must work with people, lots of different people. So where did you go first? And where did you start out, if you don't mind me asking? I don't mind you asking, he said, and he thought that was odd, because he would have, had she been anyone else. Started in Houston and headed west, up to California coast, went through the Northwest, Washington and Oregon, and kept going clockwise right around the country, east to Maine, then down to the Everglades. Her eyes were wide, like she was taking in everything about him as he talked, like she was truly interested. This is your last stop, isn't it? Your year is almost up. That it is, he said, nodding and diverting his eyes. That it is. Did you find what you were looking for? He sighed. No, he said softly. I don't think so. Will you tell me what it was? He met her eyes again, looked deep into him and saw sincerity. She really wanted to know. Peace, he said. As best I can put my finger on it, it was peace I went looking for. Ah, yeah, peace. That one's on my wish list, too. I wrote Santa about it. Before he could decide if she was joking or not, one of the waitresses came over calling, I need 2 Margaritavilles and a Bud Light, Sophia. Margaritavilles? Darryl asked. One of my specialties. I invented it. She winked and moved down the bar, pulling glasses, pouring from 3 bottles at a time. He widened his eyes, impressed, and she saw him watching, flipped one of the bottles in the air, caught it, and kept on pouring. She was not just a bartender, he thought. She was not just an anything. I have to deliver these. The girls are underage. He nodded and watched her go, thinking maybe a meaningless holiday fling wasn't such a great idea. A guy could get himself in too deep with a girl like Sophie McIntyre.